Hello and welcome to another session of our course Marketing Management Part 1. So, we are in this buyer behavior module which is going in the week of 5th and week 6th, and this is lecture 5 of this module of this week. So, till now we were discussing about the specific characteristics of industrial markets. Specifically, we talked about the differences in the industrial markets or B2B market versus consumer market, and I have tried to explain this these differences through this model, where we have shown two types of interfaces. Marketing and sales exist as a basically a interface organization between customers and the organization, and the external interface, that is marketing and sales and customer. There are differences in the form of complex buying process. I have explained to you there are many things which explain why the B2B buying behavior is much more complex than individuals buying process. I also talked about that there are fewer buyers as compared to B2C markets, sometimes even so small that you can count them on your fingertips. And then you have derived demand. That means your demand is dependent on the end customer, where the product of your customer is going finally. So, your demand is also dependent on the different industry sectors demand. And then we also talked about the geographical concentration on this external interface part, where we have looked into that that customers are generally located in industrial market on only in certain geographical areas, I mean to a very limited geographical area. And then we have looked into the other side, which is a internal interface. So, we looked into this marketing and sales and operations interface, and there the difference is that between B2B market and B2C market is that B2B market is predominantly in the form of technology sales, technical criteria are an important purchasing criteria. Then we have looked into this the second difference, which is customized solution, that the demands or the needs of the business customers are very rigid. Actually, they are inflexible, unlike in B2C market, where I gave you the example that if you do not get a color that you wanted to, maybe you will still settle down with a number 2 choice in terms of your color. However, industrial customer will not settle for a different type of valve or a different kind of compressor design. So, that is why it is a very customized market. And then we have also looked into this third difference, which is make to order. So, with this I basically have covered all the differences between B2B market and B2C market. That explains the difference in the behavior of the customers also. Then some of the differences that some of these differences that leads to the changes in the marketing program, that the generalized version of differences in B2B marketing versus B2C marketing is that you will see that in B2B market a majority of marketing effort is focused upon customer education and market development, because you have to go to the customer, explain to them what your product does. Functionality is the most important thing. Functional needs are far more important than probably hedonic needs. Hedonic needs are said to be very minimal in the case of B2B market. It is believed to be a rational decision making process. Then you have segmentation criteria. If you look at another difference in B2B marketing versus B2C marketing is, while you see that to a large extent customer markets are segmented on demographic and psychographic criteria like age, lifestyle, personality. So, those are the things which help you to segment the customers market. When we talk about B2B market, the segmentation is on a different criteria, though they are contextualize in the context of the B2B market, again the demographic criteria and the behavioral aspect of B2B market. So, industry characteristics, purchase quantities, technical requirements, benefit based and buying behavior, these are the things which form the basis of segmentation in industrial markets. And another aspect which makes it very different B2B marketing from B2C marketing is that focused promotion is focused upon communicating price and performance. So, because that helps customers to gauge the value which is inherent in the product. So, you will see that price and performance are talked and that is something which is emphasized upon. One thing you will see which is very different from B2C market is that in B2B market buyer and sellers often meet through trade shows. So, trade shows are an extremely important place to promote your products and to meet your potential buyers and your suppliers. And one thing which is becoming very important with the advent of social media is that content marketing are also becoming very important in the promotion of B2B products. So, these are some of the key differences. And then you also have the differences in the form of product differentiation is generally not restricted only to product characteristics, it is also the products are also differentiated from the vendor they are coming from. So, vendor relationship, technical characteristics or the services provided by the vendor are also important source of product differentiation. Then when we come to the channels of distribution, this is something which is very different from B2C market, is that compared to B2C market where you have a customer size is far more large and they are diffused across the geographies. So, you will see that different kind of distribution system here. Since the customers have geographical concentration, your customers you will see that the distribution channels are narrower. One important thing is that instead of you have individual sales agent selling, you will see that instead of on a deal a sales team will be working on, and many a times because of the transaction size and the technical characteristics of the product, sales force will be preferred over external channels. So, these are some of the important characteristics and the differences in the marketing program that we have discussed in the context of B2B market. Then I will take you to the some of the other important concept in the context of B2B market, but I will take you back to the initial classes of this module on buying behavior. You can recall that we classify that buying situation in 3 different types depending on the kind of purchase it is. So, what kind of problem you are trying to solve. So, if it is absolutely a new product that are the first time you are going to buy something, then it is a new task buying. Then if you have already purchased a product, but you felt like there is a change in the probably there is something that you have learned from your previous experiences and then you want to change something, then that comes under modified rebuy, and then you have a straight rebuy. Again these 3 situations exist in the context of B2B marketing also. So, keep that concept of this buying situation in mind, and then I will introduce to you this concept of buying center. Buying center is that differentiate B2C customers from B2B customers. Instead of individual customers, you have a group of people who form a group of individual that is labeled as buying center. So, buying center is defined as decision making unit of a buying organization. So, the people who are involved in the purchase decision are termed as a buying center. So, buying center has actually different roles, as explained in the slide. You can see that a buying center has 7 important roles: initiator, influencer, decider, approver, buyer, user and gatekeeper. So, user is the person who is actually really someone who uses or someone who operates with the product, and then the initiator is the person who has also the authority to initiate the purchase process. So, he is the person who can put his request for the purchase of a particular product. Then you have influencer, the people who have technical knowledge inside the organization. Generally there is a technology department, technical services department in many of the manufacturing sector companies. So, you will see those are the influencers, and there could be other influencer also. So, these are the influencer who determines what products to be purchased, from which vendor to be purchased, and how it has to be purchased. So, these people are called influencer. Then you have the decider who gives the final decision that whether we should go ahead with this product or not, and then you have approver, someone who finally in the form of has a financial authority and gives the clearances to that kind of purchases. Then you have buyer, the people who work with your supplier. So, these are basically the people in your purchasing organization, procurement department. And then you have gatekeeper, someone who can stop you from reaching to the remaining 6 different roles. Is someone like receptionist could be the gatekeeper, or someone in the purchasing organization could also be the gatekeeper. So, I have tried to explain this concept of buying center through an example that a hypothetical company, a Mumbai based company, Renowned Petrochemicals Limited, is going to commission a new plant, and in the process looking to purchase following equipment and machineries. So, high pressure compressor, catalyst rotary pump, desktop computer and printers for plant manager. So, you see they are purchasing equipments for the plant, and they are also purchasing things like a laptop and computer and the printers for their the working of official works of their plant manager. Now, you see in this case, if we talk about this first purchase, which is high pressure compressor, maybe the shift operator who operates that compressor, he has seen the existing compressor, and he found out that it is not in good condition, and he has reported to his shift supervisor. So, here the shift operator is basically the user. However, he does not have that authority in the organization, or he does not have the those kind of purchasing request related authority to basically initiate the purchase process in the system. So, shift supervisor is here the initiator. Sometimes however, you will find out the user and the initiator could be the same people. So, these are basically the shift supervisor will put up the request that you need basically a new compressor. Then you have people in the technical services, they understand once your requirement, and then basically they see what are the ways to fulfill those requirements. So, they will also tell you what are the different options in terms of the product which can fulfill. You will see that since lot of changes in the technology happens, so they will see whether the previous generation of the technology is better, or the newer version which is available now is better. In terms of the cost benefit analysis, they will provide you the inputs. Then you have the plant head who will basically provide the decision that yes, okay, we need a compressor, so we should go ahead for that. But because of its the kind of transaction amount it might be, and he does not have that financial authority. So, the deal has to go to, or the purchase has to go, request has to go to the site president in that plant, who will finally approve. Many times it also happens that approver and the decider could also be the same, because the purchase is within the purchasing limit of that decider, he can directly purchase for it. Then you have once the site president approves it, it goes to the purchase department, and then they start looking for the supplier who can potentially supply the product. Then they request for the proposal from the suppliers, and then they deal with the rest of the process. So, you see here the gatekeeper could be the receptionist, who may basically not allow a particular salesman from a company to reach to any of these important decision makers. So, now you have understood the concept of buying center. You have to also understood one thing is that while I was discussing, depending on the buying situation, there could be new task buying, there could be modified rebuy, there could be routine purchase. So, you see that in case of new task buying, maybe the role, some of these roles like role of a technical services, role of the user and role of the decider could have a very important influences in the buying center. So, the buying center more tilted towards maybe more tilted towards their views. On the other side, when it is just a routine purchase, maybe none of these people might be involved, and the purchasing, someone from the purchasing department can just decide because they understand what is the need of the user department, and they just order based on their prior experience. So, now I will explain to you this buyer behavior model in the context of B2B marketing, and then you can also see that when you compare it with this B2C buying model, which has 5 stages, that is need recognition, information search, evaluation of alternative, purchase decision and post purchase. This B2B buying process involves more stage and it is far more complex. As you can see on the slides, again it starts with the need recognition. The user tells you that what he needs. So, then the first thing that happens once user understand that he needed a product, the next thing is that the information is gathered about what is basically the description of that need. So, if I want to purchase a laptop for my research associate, so I have to tell basically what are the product description, or maybe I can, in spite of instead of saying that I need a laptop, I may just say that my research associate needs a computing device with the size of the RAM, the size or probably the type of microprocessor, the type of the screen, and maybe the different things which could be critical for the kind of usage he has. So, in case like if I am purchasing it for my research associate, maybe I will ask for a very high capacity of RAM, and maybe I will also ask for a higher storage capacity, higher memory capacity. So, those are the specific which are related with the needs. So, the whole detail of that need description is required. Once you have the need description, then the people in the technical side will ascertain that based on those needs what are the different products available. Sometimes it will happen that whatever you may need may not exactly match with the product. So, you will see that the technical team and the product team within the organization on the buyer side will work with those users, and they will help them to basically fine tune their need description and then come out with a product specification. So, that will match with the possible offerings in the market. So, that will lead them to product specification. Once you come out with your product description, then you go for basically the supplier search, who are the potential people who can supply. So, here probably you will need to find out who can possibly supply to the user or the location of that particular organization. That could be something which is very important. Once you have got the proposal from the suppliers, the next thing is that proposal solicitation. So, once you identify the supplier, you request them to supply the proposal. Once the supplier comes out with the proposal, then you basically evaluate those proposals, and organizations have a different ways of analyzing the proposal depending on the basically the kind of product they are purchasing and the kind of purchasing policy that organization has. Based on those analysis, you will see that supplier selection will happen, and many times in the government organization you will see that there are two phase bid in any kind of purchase proposal, that is technical bid and the commercial bid. First basically suppliers are evaluated based on the technical bid, where you see whether the product that they want to supply to you fulfills the user's requirement or not. If it exceeds, it is fine. If it does not exceed, then you eliminate those supplier. Once that is finished, the second phase of that is that you evaluate based on the commercial aspect, that price that they are supplying and the other conditions of the supply, like the time period for the delivery, the time the conditions for after sales service. So, those become some of the important things, and then based on these analysis you make your supplier selection, and once you decide your supplier, then you work with those suppliers and try to fine tune that are you come out with the specifics of the deal. So, in the large transactions you will also see that this order specification takes a bit of time, where probably after sales services related issues are negotiated, and other terms and the conditions of the deal are also negotiated. And the last thing that comes in this business buying process is the performance review. You will see that all organizations will have this process in place, that formally or informally they will review their suppliers on a certain time period. Some organization may basically evaluate their supplier on a annual basis, some may probably review them on a even at a lesser time. So, however, they will basically try to analyze the supplier's performance, and the renewing of the contract of the supplier depends on this performance review. So, this is basically the business buying process, the stages in the business buying process, and now you compare it with the B2C buying process, where you have 5 steps, and compared to that you can understand this is far more intensive in terms of the information search. You can also understand that this will take far more time also, and if you understand the different functional roles, you can also understand that the different functional people will the functional roles will come into the picture at different time of purchase. So, in the initial stage you can understand at the time of need recognition, probably the role of user and the initiator is very important, and at the time of need description again they will be important, and then along with them the technical people will come into the picture, and then the role of technical people become very important till the time of product specification, and also sometimes their recommendation is very critical in the supplier search. Then once you start the supplier search, then procurement people come into the picture. So, you see the whole buying center, the different roles are coming into the picture, and their roles are their roles and the importance of those roles is changing with the time actually. So, now I conclude this session here. As I have already explained to you the buying center concept and the business buying process. So, now I have explained to you the major differences in B2B buying with respect to B2C buying. So, I have explained to you the concept of buying center, and I have explained to you the different steps in the business buying process. Now, when you compare it with consumer market, you will be able to understand the key differences in terms of the time, the decision making process. The decision being far more information intensive, it is far more rational, and it is mostly functional need oriented decision making process. So, I conclude this session here, and when we will meet into the next session, that will be a concluding session about this buyer behavior, and we will talk about the specific dimensions of industrial buyer. Okay, thank you very much.